and this will be a very short presentation or short introduction from us here at Zangenberg. This is not the first time that we are having a webinar together with SMT Data, and I think that the two companies represent a unique set of insights when it comes to today's topic on mainframe. This is a changing market, and I think many of you will agree that many things are happening right now in the mainframe market, and there are many opportunities for optimization and for substantial cost reduction for the mainframe clients in Europe. We will look into, during today's presentations, into the many metrics used for pricing and how you can optimize on them. We'll look into the differences between the fixed and the variable components, and we'll dive into to software, which is a huge cost driver and also an important cost optimization area. And I think most important of all, we'll have a real live case in the middle of today's presentation. So without further ado, I think I'd like to give the word and the PowerPoint presentation to Stephen Thomas. Stephen, will you give us a bit on the Q, and Frederick will take us through the P at the end of this session.
Yes, I'll be happy to take over here. Let me just share my screen. So as Henrik mentioned, we work together on the two sides of the equation here, where we look very much on the quantity side, how much capacity are you using, and Henrik and his team are specialists on the P side, the price side. And you put the two of those together to determine your costs, and both can be optimized. I'm going to be talking about outsourcer transparency. So how well is your mainframe outsourcer managing your capacity and performance? So the first step in that is really just understanding what you pay for. What are the units that are being measured out there? And as Henrik and Frederick from Zangenberg will tell you, what you're paying for is lots of stuff, and they're experts on, pricing out all these different components: CPU, storage, memory, software, backup, etc., etc., etc. I'm going to be focusing very much on the CPU side and on the measurement of the CPU side, because very often outsourcers are going to roll a lot of this other stuff into the CPU price. So typically you'll have software and maybe even some services and some conditions, special conditions that are all going to determine what your CPU-based price is going to be. And what's important here when you're looking at CPU is that contracts are often fuzzy on what are the actual units that are used for billing, CPU seconds, MIPS, MSU, which I'll talk a lot about today. How those units are measured or calculated, you may think that's straightforward, but I'll show you it's not always straightforward. And very importantly, often contracts are a little bit fuzzy on access to the data that's used to do the calculation of the billing, and good reporting around that, so you can figure out, what am I paying for? Why is my bill going up? Is the outsourcer calculating it correctly? So let's just quickly dive into some of the sort of measurement metrics that you can use as a basis for paying for your CPU capacity with an outsourcer. Now, obviously, the basic one is CPU seconds. This is the one that's measured by the operating system, the number of seconds the CPU has been busy doing work for you. That's fundamentally what you're paying for. It's measured and reported directly by the operating system in the SNF. The problem with it is not normalized. So as your outsourcer changes the hardware configuration, puts on faster hardware, more CPUs, the number of CPU seconds needed to do the same amount of work is going to change. So generally, it's not used for billing purposes, or if it is used for billing purposes, then there's some mechanism in the contract to adjust the price as the configuration changes. But it's sort of the basic unit from which everything else is derived. Then we have MIPS. MIPS is very commonly used as a billing for CPU power. Originally, MIPS stood for 1 million instructions per second, but it's no longer directly related to the number of instructions. It's just a way of normalizing based on some industry standard tables, CPU utilization across different hardware models and configurations. So in theory, the same workloads use roughly the same number of MIPS, no matter what configuration it's going to run on. So you're going to pay the same to get the same amount of work done, even though the outsourcer may change the hardware configuration. Now, the challenge with MIPS, as we'll see, is it's not something you can measure directly. It's something that's calculated based on CPU seconds and a configuration-dependent MIPS factor. And we'll talk a lot more about how that happens, because there's a lot of ways of doing that. The third big one is MSU. It's originally stood for 1 million service units. It's calculated based on factors determined by IBM, because IBM uses MSU to do software billing. So like MIPS, it's a way of normalizing the CPU utilization across different models, but rather than it happening in sort of a transparent way, it's happening in a way that IBM determines based on their software pricing policies. So again, in theory, you're going to use roughly the same MSU across different configurations. But IBM may, for commercial reasons, adjust these factors, so you're a little bit in IBM's pocket if you're using MSUs. MSUs can also be confusing because, there's hardware MSUs, roughly 5 to 5.5 MIPS. There's something called software MSUs, which is typically the one we're talking about when we talk about MSUs, roughly 8 to 8.5 MIPS. And then there's a rolling 4-hour average of these MSUs. And then there's the hourly average of the individual 4-hour rolling average measurements. This is what's reported in the SCRT report, which is what IBM uses as the basis for its billing. And then there's the monthly peak of these averages, which is typically what the outsourcer is paying for. So again, when you use the term MSU, it could mean any one of these 5 things. Just comparing MIPS and MSU, because MIPS shown with the orange line here on the right is measured every hour. Typically, it's a little bit more spiky. The rolling 4-hour average MSU is much flatter because it is a rolling average. But notice also that it's going to be based on the previous 4 to 5 hours actually. So the spike or the peak hour for the MSU is going to typically be different than the peak hour for the MIPS. And sometimes very different. You can have a peak in the evening, for example, here, which is very high. That isn't reflected in the rolling 4-hour average MSU because it's a much narrower peak. So just be aware there's a very big difference in the way the usage patterns look depending on whether you're looking at MIPS or MSU. Some of the advantages and disadvantages for billing purposes with MIPS and MSU, MIPS are directly computed from the CPU seconds in a hopefully transparent way. We'll come back to that. It's independent of IBM's pricing policies. You can calculate MIPS for both CP and ZIP. Now, MSU, you can only calculate for CP. I can be calculated on all levels, so at the LPAR level, the batch job level, the transaction level. Disadvantages of MIPS is, as showed before, they can be somewhat spiky, and the computation method for MIPS can be open to discussion, so it has to be contractually agreed, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Advantages of MSU, you get a much flatter view since there's a rolling 4-hour average. It's measured directly. There's no room for interpretation. IBM determines how it's calculated. And IBM may give a bonus sometimes for upgrading to newer hardware. They've done that in the past. Last few hardware models, they have not done it, but sometimes you get a bonus that way. And it can give you an alignment of interest with your outsourcer, because your outsourcer is most likely paying IBM primarily based on MSU. Disadvantages with MSU, as I said, it is affected by IBM's pricing policy. So, IBM can in the future adjust the MSU factors that will then affect you. You can only measure it at the OPAR level, and it only includes CP or general processors and is not useful for doing zip billing. And of course, there's this risk of confusion, as I mentioned before. There's hardware MSUs, software MSUs, and rolling 4-hour average MSUs. Good. Let's dig a little bit more into MIPS. Now, MIPS, as I said, is calculated based on CPU seconds times a configuration-dependent MIPS factor. So for contractual purpose, this MIPS factor is generally determined based on the effective machine model, and which is determined by what kind of model is this, Z13, Z14, and the number of CPUs on that model. And then we look up in a standard table for that model and this number of CPUs, how many MIPS do we expect it to deliver. So Watson Walker, IBM, Gartner all provide standard tables for doing this. There's many other factors that are going to affect your actual MIPS, which are a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. Your workload characteristics, for affinity, overall system load, and many other things. But for contractual purposes, what we typically work with is just these two things: what's the model and what's the MIPS table we're using to determine the MIPS. So finding the effective model, as I said, is affected by the number of processors. So more processors means more overhead and fewer MIPS delivered per CPU second. And also newer models generally deliver more MIPS per CP than older ones, typically because they have a faster clock time or better instructions or bigger cache and faster cache. So here's just an example where we look at a Z13 2964 and just look at the decline in the MIPS rate as we add more processors to this machine. So if you just have one processor on this machine, it's going to be running at about 1700 MIPS. If you have it fully configured with 140 processors, it's only going to deliver about 800 MIPS per processor. So that's why the number of processors on the physical machine is important to understand the MIPS rate. So once we figured out the model number and the number of processors, we can just look up in a standard table like Watson Walker here and say what's the MIPS rate per processor for this particular configuration. Here we use average RNI. I don't have time to go into RNI, but RNI is sort of a reflection of the kind of workload you have. Is it very good at using the cache or not good at using the cache, and this will very much affect your MIPS rate. But for contractual purposes and for benchmarking across different models, we typically, industry standard, always take the average RNI to do this calculation.
I think it's very important that this is just to emphasize the contractual part, that you have a very clear definition of this. I think Stephen will also be able to confirm that we've had quite a lot of less productive cases where this language was unclear, and the whole discussion around the MIPS rate and sizing of that. What are the basic processes for that, and it has huge impact on the overall costs. Typically, it's a neglected area where also clients don't have full transparency when moving into, for example, a new Z15 model and so on. What are the principles for the rating? How do you calculate that? How does SIP impact the rating and so on? All of these basic processes are typically neglected a little bit, and some of the vendors will try to optimize inside those interpretations. So yeah.
That's a very, very good point. And I think I've said it before, one of the pitfalls here, and I'll come to pitfalls in a minute, is that, this mechanism is not well defined in the contract. We've also seen cases where it is well defined in the contract, but we find out that the outsourcers actually hasn't necessarily read their own contract and is actually billing based on a different model than what's in the contract. Good. So now that we have figured out the MIPS rate, we just take the number of CPU seconds per hour, because typically MIPS for billing purposes is calculated per hour, divide by the number of seconds in an hour, and multiply by the MIPS per processor in order to get the number of MIPS for billing purposes. So if we're using 1,000 CPU seconds, then for this particular model we looked at before with a MIPS rate of 1071, we get 297.5 MIPS being used by this 1,000 CPU seconds on this model. So it's a fairly straightforward calculation. What's complex is how do you get to this MIPS rate, and how do you agree on this MIPS rate? So best practice, and I think this is what Frederick said also, have a clear definition of MIPS in your contract. And this should include, our view is, you should be including not just the CPs, but also the ZIPs to determine the model. There's a lot of discussion about this in the literature and among performance experts, but there's no question that adding ZIPs to a processor will affect the CPs to some degree. So our recommendation is just add the number of CPs and to the number of ZIPs to determine the model. Obviously ignoring any processors that are dedicated and offline. Use a MIPS table from an independent source like Watson Walker or IBM. Some outsourcers use their own internally derived tables. Be careful of that, because then they kind of get to decide what MIPS rate they're working with. Use the average RNI and base your MIPS measurements for billing purposes at the LPAR level on the SMF 70. And of course, ensure reporting and access to data that allow you to follow up on the above and validate and calibrate this and make sure that you are actually being billed based on the MIPS rates and calculations in the contract, because people do make mistakes. So once we've calculated the MIPS, outsourcers are extremely creative on determining, what the MIPS rate is actually used for in billing. So, for example, the typical one is your peak MIPS per LPAR per month, or rolling 4-hour average MSU, or rolling 4-hour average MIPS per month. Peak hour during only working hours during working days, because the outsourcer has lots of excess capacity at night, so they may not charge you for that. Percentile peak, like the 95th percentile is a typical one, or 98th percentile. You have to be aware of whether your peaks are calculated independently for each LPAR, which will be best for your outsourcer, or whether you're going to combine your LPARs and look at the combined peak. Look at, are your CP and ZIP calculated together, or are they separately? A lot of outsourced customers are paying based on capacity, so what's the weight, or the number of LCPs, or the capping on the LPAR. Maybe the total or average usage during the month rather than the peak usage. Bans, for example, penalties for using too much or too little relative to the agreement. And of course, all kinds of combinations of the above. So it's not just about calculating the MIPS, it's also understanding which, MIPS hour or which combinations of hours are used in the final billing. Good. Just some best practice here. Work towards the alignment of interest with your outsourcer. It helps to understand, what their cost drivers are, so that you can work together to save money together. Ensure transparency through access to data and reporting. Don't just be dependent on your outsourcer sending you a bill. Be in a position to go out and validate that bill is being correctly calculated. Understand your own usage patterns when considering alternate billing models. Depending on how your usage patterns are, some billing models will be better for you than others. Avoid complexity that doesn't add value. We've seen some very complex models out there where all they're doing is creating a lack of transparency and a lot of work for everybody. And of course, understand the relationship between cost and quality of service. That's really a whole nother presentation, but the two are of course very closely related. And in the end, the most important thing for most of you is going to be quality of service. That you're getting good performance, good turnaround time. Your users are experiencing a good, stable, well-performing environment. Good. That was a little bit of sort of background on what can be measured and how to calculate it. It's important to be able to follow up on this. And I'll just very quickly, because I'm aware of the time here, go through some of the monitoring that's important for you to have as an outsourced customer. One is access to the SMF70, so you can see, what hardware model are you running on, how many processors are out there, what's the total weight of all the LPARs, any group capping out there, because all this is information that's going to affect both your bill and your quality of service. You need this information in order to be able to calculate the MIPS rate, for example. You need also from the SMF70 to be able to see your own LPAR configuration, the number of logical processors, the weight of your LPAR, any capping going on in your LPAR, because all this again is going to affect your costs and quality of service. You want to be able to see things like zip eligible. Do you have workload that could have run on a zip if you had enough zip capacity, but ends up running on the more expensive CPs because there just wasn't enough capacity there on the zip. So this is something we end up paying extra for something you could have gotten cheaper if your system had been well configured. Similarly with vertical affinity is, high vertical affinity is, a tendency for the LPAR to come back and run on the same physical processor again and again, more likely to find this data in cache, wasting less cycles, getting your cache data, you'll get a better MIPS rate. So keeping track of the vertical affinity you're getting is very important, and often small adjustments in the configuration of your LPAR can give you better vertical affinity, and basically mean you get more work done for less money if you're getting good vertical affinity. Monitoring your RNI, this is how effectively your application is using the cache. Again, these are things you can affect through your workload, but also your outsourcer can affect through the configuration. So, the ability to follow up on this, for example, through the SMF113 is important. Monitoring your response time, again, saving money is good, but quality of service, stable operations is even more important. Being able to follow up on your response time for CICS, DB2, IMS, WebSphere, MQ, whatever you're working with. Again, this is very important. Identifying applications for tuning. This is one of my last slides, and this kind of leads into the presentation from DNB, where having the data to go in and understand what's going on during your peak billing hours, breaking it down in terms of workloads, breaking it down in terms of jobs or transactions or DB2 plans and packages is critical for your ability to manage your costs and go in and optimize and reduce your costs. But the next presentation is really going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So in summary, this is an outsourced environment. It's going to be a shared environment. There will be compromises. You do have to be aware of that. You do get a lot of benefits from sharing a large platform with other people, but there are also going to be compromises. It's really important to have a clear and common understanding, documented understanding with your outsourcer of what are you paying for, how is it measured or calculated, how do you monitor it, and what can you do about it? As you see your bill increasing, what's your ability to go in and react to that and understand the root cause and do something about the root cause. So it's about having access to good reporting tools, ideally self-service, so you don't have to go in and ask your outsourcer for this information, but you can go in and draw it yourself. And again, have access to an independent, trusted advisor if you don't have the skills in-house to work with this data and really understand this data. So one of the things that we provide to help out customers on this is an offering we call the Mainframe Outsourcing Health Check, where the objective is really to go in and review the current outsourced situation based on some real data, identify optimization potential, optionally validate any invoices, and establish a roadmap going forward. So this really involves getting some SMF data from your environment, loading it into our analysis tools, letting some of our consultants go in and look at this, optionally also understanding your commercial agreement with your outsourcer, and then coming back with a presentation, a workshop to help you dig into this. So again, feel free to contact us if you want any help or just have some discussions with us in this area. Good. I think that was a little bit more than my 15 minutes. And as I think as Patricia said in the beginning, we're happy to take any questions. Please write them in the chat. We'll gather them up at the end and get back to them. But also, please feel free to contact me directly if we don't have time to get to all of your questions on this webinar. So with that, I'm going to hand it back. So I think Patricia, correctly, if I'm correct, it's Odin is the next on the agenda.
I think we'll just switch to Autumn, right? And if you can share your presentation, Autumn.
Yes, I will. I'm in process. Now, do you see something?
Yeah.
We do, yeah.
Yes, thanks.
Good. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank SMT Data for inviting me to present there. I know that I do understand that, of course, it's because it's so much more convincing to have some customers telling things about how great it is, so that's fine. For me, I thought this would be a start of going to fancy conferences and things, and now we're like everyone else, just stuck in our home office. That's fine. DNB, that is the Norske Bank. We are like the largest bank in Norway. I won't go through all the details. We are around 9,500 employees. And out of that, we are about 830 in the IT department. So the largest bank in Norway, I would say in European scale, they are probably a mid-sized bank. I work as a performance specialist. I am a part of the exclusive 5-member group APO, Application and Platform Optimization. I studied at the Norwegian Institute of Technology, NIT, so any confusion with MIT is strictly intended. The last 20 years I worked on performance problem in all kind of large heterogeneous IT environments. What is the system landscape we are speaking about? Like many banks, we have a plethora of legacy systems of a score of partitions. Some of them I use a lot, some of them I hardly ever log into. And typically, even if you know the general trend for each of them, in a problem situation, you do not immediately know which one is a problem. So it's the big environment to watch. Monitoring tools. You are seeing the presentation, aren't you?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Monitoring tool. How do we efficiently monitor such a problem landscape? For detailed analysis, I turn to PMON, SDSF, and especially the detector, since most of the mess you make in SQL. So an SQL monitor is of course the most useful tool for these things. But I think neither of these really provide a good starting point. You risk not seeing the wood for all the trees. So that is where I come to what I call a day in life. I can phrase Paul McCartney: woke up, got out of bed, and dragged the comb across my head. And in these COVID days, it's a terribly short time from that part to going down and to my home office and log into it. So this is the main screen, and they did a redesign a couple of years ago. So now everything I actually use is stored in Hyperdrill. It really makes me feel like a deep dive nerd, but okay, that's fine. So I typically start by going into Hyperdrill, and then for me, the way I work, I typically go into job and tasks as the next part. And this screen is the next screen I get up. Of course, the colors could be better, but the information are really is here. I typically, I adjust some dates and things. I get business hours, 8 to 16, and the last week and a day. So I see this day and I see all the 5 earlier business days. In that way I can compare, so not this day, the last day, because we are 1 day behind, but here I can see, for instance, how was this day compared to other days, and the last time is for the last Friday. This is a Friday, like from 5th of September. So here's a Friday, and then it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So I can compare, is anything normal? Is anything not as it should be? And of course, why are we interested in 8 to 16? That is because we pay this 95 percentile of hours between 8 to 16. And for all practical purposes, in a month, we select the top hours and we pay number 8 from the top. That defines it. And here I have the graph, and here I have a table which highlights the 10 top hours, giving a good view. Typically we have peaks 9 to 10 in the morning and around from 15 to 16 in the afternoon, and that is not so uncommon for a bank. There are a lot of people going on in the morning. There is a lot of activity in the forecast at 4 o'clock in Bank Norway. Okay, so this was quite fun. I'm happy. Then I look at all hours for the last week. Is there anything happening between 16 in the afternoon and 8 in the morning? Well, we don't pay for it, but it could be interesting anyhow. Bad code is bad code no matter when you run it. So here is something interesting. It's like from the 4th September. Let's drill a little bit into that. Now I just choose 2 days, 24 and 25th. And here I see, okay, I have 2 peaks. One is at 8 o'clock and one is at 10 o'clock in the evening. I go a little bit closer, just 1 hour, because if I do that, then I see just the jobs or processes that are running in this very hour. And here I see, like, okay, from my knowledge, here is something which is somewhat uncommon. I recognize them as some batch jobs. So now I can look into Detector and see what is this. So here I find some high numbers in Detector, 8 o'clock in the afternoon and evening. Quite high CPU usage. And I see this is a DB2 job or program for running specific SQL. So this I can say, okay, here is somebody probably extracting some data. I can go and look at SQL and I can see if I can optimize this. In that case, I also discuss with the programmers, so they know if it's bad code, we try to avoid them having to run bad code several times. So we try to get to the I will not go into the SQL here because that's not part of this presentation. We had another case this summer. where we, for some integration service, which we have on one part, two helpers, we have seen a fairly stable pattern, and suddenly we have some ugly peaks. This was during the summer, which all banks we try to limit the changes during summer, so there was really no new functionality here. So that was quite interesting. What's this? It's not always that we actually try to pin, but we are able to pin down things through other analyzing tools, so then we send them here we have these graphs and some other observations to what I call the list of useful suspects. We do have such a list. And after a couple of rounds of trying to convince someone on the usual suspect list this may be your problem, we found out that yes, there was some new functionality. It had been put into production before the summer, but they started to use it now. So when people say no, there are no changes in the system, you always have to really stress them a little bit. One thing is to put new functionality into in the code into the production. Another thing is to actually start using it. And here we had a service that every time we called it by a mistake or by some timeouts, executed 2, 3, sometimes 4 times. And when you test it, of course, it gives the correct functional answer back anyhow. It could run once or twice, or 3 times. But for performance, that was quite the difference. So this was maybe a small problem, but DMP isn't so large that like 1,600, 1,800 MIPS, we cannot let that just slip. It's not a trifle for us after all. And then we go to the big picture. This is another way of using it. When I started in the bank a little bit more than 2 years ago, I got a report on my desk stating that MIPS consumption was increasing. Well, isn't it always, I would say. But it was quite a lot, and the business usage was not so much higher. So we were like kindly asked to spend some of our time on it. And as we can see in IPI, it is really an increase, like from 13,000 to more than 20,000 MIPS. That's a 50% increase in a couple of years. That costs some money. So then we have to try to find out what to do, where to put in an effort. And here is really one good way of using it. We could look at some workdays, I think I just took a month. What is executing a lot during daytime, or not executing a lot, but using a lot of MIPS for CPU? To me, CPU and MIPS is like liters and gallons of gasoline. So, because I always work in the same machines, I just calculated it. So here we see we have some processes, QP and QA and QP, something BRK, and those are brokers. This is some integration software from IBM. And here I could just dump this to Excel and filter, calculate, and get only the broker because there are lots of them. And I could add that through, and in average this was 5,500 MIPS, and that is 32% of all consumption. And that was in one way good news, and in one way not so good news. The not so good news was this integration component. We really didn't have deep knowledge. We have really deep knowledge of how to optimize DB2, DL1, CSCS, and also in batch jobs. Normally we can be to the spot really fast. This tool was a little bit more unknown for us in the optimization department. That was the bad news. The good news was, of course, that no one else had really tried to optimize this. So it's so much easier to get some result. And remember, it is really important when you try to get MIPS consumption down in the system to go for the really large consumer. Because if you have a service that consumes 100 MIPS an hour and you optimize that by 90%, you remove 90% of the traffic, that was 90 MIPS an hour. But if you start going after something like this with 5,400 MIPS an hour and you're able to take 10% there, then you save 540 MIPS, 5 times the amount. So the right thing is to go for the big components, whether you have a lot of knowledge of it or not. Just go for them. We did a number of changes, and one thing we could do in HitBuild now was actually saying, putting a trend, and now we did this change, and now we did that change. We had some pending payment change in functionality, and then we got a solid dip. We removed some logging, we got a solid dip, and then we started to suspect that we also had some memory creep, so we tried the broker restart. That was also quite a result. And this is really important because processes like this, all the managers want us to find the problem in 3 days, and in day 4, magically it's solved. It isn't always like that. It's, especially here where some of it is things we try and some of it is application changes. It takes time to get these things into production. And then in this way we can actually show, yes, you have given us 100,000 euro or 1 million euro, and here are the results. We are partly on the way. So these graphs over time, which SMP data just stores readily for you. SMP data has all the basis data, and then you can extract them. That gives you a possibility to build a story like this. And this story is important to get funded. So, what did this look after about 1 year of work? Well, now we have turned the tide and we are actually able to press it down. Here you see the summer holiday in Norway, by the way, and here you see the COVID lockdown in March. It's really funny, you can see history in these graphs. But we are able to slowly turn it back, so we are now back on like something 2018. Yeah, I would say that. And there is a long list of changes in doing this. It's not just one fix, but in the integration tool, we removed some double format conversion. We had thought that it would be nice to have all formats pass into XML before we transform it further on, because everyone will be able to hook onto XML. And then you have to be a little bit dramatic. Is anyone after 5 years using any of the XML? And the answer was no. We had a good number of applications for logging. That was very useful, but it cost a lot. So we removed quite a lot of that. We also started to restart the brokers regularly. And then we have removed some of the broker traffic. I have a broker on Mainframe and we use that for even Unix to Unix traffic. And in the end, we saw that maybe we don't have to take the traffic through them. Also, there were other things we did which was not related to the integration component. We optimized some batch jobs. You can say the batch job run during night, but sometimes when they take a long time, they spill into online time, and typically that happens on peak day in banks. There is a lot of traffic during the night, and of course there is a lot of traffic on some of the worst days online, so it spills over and it can cost quite a lot. We found a couple of SQLs very high on the list, on the top list, and we were able to optimize that. And we also did some classical MDS tuning and adjusting partition size and priorities. So this is what I call a career-defining graph. We compared the traffic of August 2019, we started this work in September 2019, with the traffic in August 2020. And this is, it's not so really scientifically, but it is a 25% reduction. And this is total mix used by the bank. This is not a selected set of partitions or things. This is for the whole bank. And for those of you who are actually owning contracts with IBM or an outsourcer, you know that this is quite a lot of money. And I would say also 25% mix reduction overall in a mid-sized bank. That is, I find it quite okay. And we also took for the September, we could still see the trend is confirmed. This is just some of the graphs for fun. So these savings really resulted in lower IT costs. So, and I think also IPI was really a key for this, because this was really high level tuning. What is the big cost? Okay, we find the big components. And then to ensure funding, we also use IPI to show, okay, here are the results intermediate all the way going along. So we were all the time able to get more money and so on, because we could show that if we say 500 units, and that is also quite a good amount of money, will you invest more money? So without more ado, that's it of this story. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for that inspiring deep dive into career-defining moments. I think we all are searching for those career-defining moments. And
just a last comment. I cannot guarantee that all of you who works in banks or whatever you work will find 25% like this. But you know, if anyone had told me 2 years ago we would find 25%, I would say you should smoke some other cigarettes. You know, to me it was really, I did not expect to be able to find CPU consumption to be optimized in this.
Oh, so but I think that's a very good point to take away from this, as we also mentioned in the beginning, that typically we see quite substantial savings potentials in these larger mainframe contracts, and I think that's a good segue to Frederik. Frederik, you will be giving us a little bit on the pricing side.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for that inspiring talk, and also I think this the findings on the quantity side, the Q side, that was a big part of the DMD saving here is of course one of the components. The other one that we are very focused on is the pricing side, and I'll not spend too much time about what we do, but Mainframe has been a core part of and optimizing IT contracts. Has been a big part of our portfolio for the past 12 years, and we approach this from a very sort of from a very statistical point of view. That's the only way to gain insights into what is generally a very bundled and not very transparent service. At least from a pricing perspective, clients have very limited insights into the exact price dynamics. And some of our good friends from IBM Software Group, CA, Broadcom, and some of the other more difficult partners we have to learn to live with are not making life easy for you guys, because we typically have compounding pricing models where we have many options and being able to just navigate your IBM bill takes you through around 40 or 50 different pricing models, which is of course fun if you are enthusiastic about this stuff like we are, but also it does mean that it can be hard to challenge pricing in this area. So that was some of the what we wanted to do today, just briefly take you through the main components of that and try to zero in on a couple of key discussions that we feel are important to keep top of mind when you are when you're entering into your next renegotiation or new contract with your with a mainframe vendor. Yeah, we've done this for quite a long time, and basically focusing a bit on the Nordics here. From the 600,000 bips that we're tracking in the Nordics, we have a quite big footprint on that. So sort of based on this knowledge that we generally advise our clients. I think the pricing is also something where we see when these big mergers are happening, IBM consolidating their footprint, taking over every operation in KMD, trying to buy out T-Systems, mainframe operations a couple of years ago, and thereby sort of changing the European footprint. What we've been involved with regards to that is sort of trying to support the authorities in trying to determine what is the price impact on that. And KMD and Every were sort of examples of this consolidation being okay from a sort of market perspective. It's reducing competition a bit in the Nordics, but still sort of not impacting pricing too badly. With the T-Systems portfolio of 7 billion euros worth of mainframe services, it was sort of the conclusion that it was not really, we couldn't really support a conclusion that this would not sort of skew the market. And this sort of mapping of what is happening with the major vendors is something we try to be very systematic about. And then we sort of build these vendor briefs, and it's also to try to help clients who are, well, IBM is the obvious player here, but also not all clients are having they're experiencing challenging times in that relationship from time to time. It's important to just understand what your alternatives are and what their capabilities are, depending on whether you're talking about an operational partner, or sort of a transformational offload partner, or whatever the case may be. I think just a simple comment on the market here, which is something we could spend a lot of time on today, but is that sort of we see the Indian players who have sort of sworn that they would be asset light, are moving quite aggressively into this space. TCS is a new player in sort of the Northern European space, and have aggressively targeted a lot of the financial services players that define slightly broader than banking, in this case with insurance and pension firms as sort of a core of that expansion, building on sort of a small IBM footprint that they established last year. So we're seeing them becoming a player. Some of these are of course a bit marginal, and I'll not spend a lot of time on this, but it's of course important to just understand what kind of installation are we talking about. CGI will not be relevant for a big bank, because they don't have the footprint to support that, and so on. But we try to keep tabs on both the operational capabilities, but also in terms of transformational. And especially for big banks, we see HCL acquiring the Rational tools as being a very important move. And a lot of the sort of banks in Northern Europe, also in the Middle East, and especially in the Nordics, have been heavy users of Rational and have a large part of the legacy portfolio built on EGL and some of these more marginal languages. That represent a risk in terms of transformation. Yeah, but we can sort of talk about that in a minute. I think if we sort of normalize sort of pricing, and sort of the composition of software. What we actually see is that the mainframe prices are coming down. This is sort of a difficult discussion when you're talking to IBM and the likes, and some of the numbers that they are presenting in terms of growth in installed MIPS. You need to understand that a big part of the ship MIPS are actually set on Linux, so they're not actually new in that sense. And of course the benefits for the clients moving in this direction, which is a trend we generally see with quite a few of the big banks who need to sort of consider the price performance aspect of this. And there is of course a different software cost related to C on Linux. But we keep track of how the prices are developing. That's a big part of the DNA we have, and try to help clients navigate how the prices are changing. But that also means that not only mainframe, but some of the infrastructure components such as servers and storage are falling dramatically in price year over year. So that means that you need to reevaluate your contract on a regular basis to make sure that you have a cost level that is sort of competitive in whatever industry you're in. Yeah, so basically I'm not spending too much time on model, but basically we do it bottom up, and that means that we're calculating the way that the vendors are building the cost, and we very much subscribe to, time has been kind to our basic way of thinking. When I started out in university studying some when we stopped being called statistics, it was called something more boring than that. But now we have analytics and machine learning and all sorts of great adjectives that we can pin this to. Basically, that's the approach we take when we look at decomposing the prices. And when you have your contract, it's very important that you have a nuanced view of what the MIPS price, what does it consist of. Housing, hardware costs, and labor tend to be relatively marginal compared to the software cost, especially when we talk about mid-sized or big banks, or almost all medium to large enterprise clients with mainframe operations need to understand how big a share typically the software costs are. Especially the composition of software is important. So that's why MIPS pricing is meaningless if we don't know what's in the MIPS, and also having the separation of scope is important. To sort of break it down into the main areas that you need to consider, basically there are 6 areas that drive costs in mainframe. Here it is. And the first one is sort of software. I'll just come back to that in a second. But to be able to comment on the overall level and normalize this stuff, you need to understand what is the specs, what is the infrastructure this is running on, and you'll of course also have these discussions with SFT data in terms of some of these rating discussions. But this is very important from the pricing models, and having been involved with also building these for a number of the vendors, there are some thresholds that clients need to know about. There are some big decisions in terms of RFPs. What kind of restrictions are we imposing on the vendors? Shared versus dedicated machines. Can we consult the number of LPARs and so on? So some of that stuff dictates basically the overall cost level, and having sort of a heterogeneous platform with several C13s and Z15s has some big impacts on IBM licensing, for example, and the way that some of the machines are sized is a big part of CA licenses, for example. So we need to understand what the hardware sort of has, how that impacts the software, but the hardware in itself is actually a relatively small part of the overall cost. A relatively few euros per MIPS is actually tied to the hardware. But it's then a big part, of course, the labor part, but typically it's important to just stick with what you know. You'll have a very good sense of whether this is a batch-heavy environment, how many jobs are actually failing, and it's actually the issues that are driving costs overall. So keep that in mind. The commercial risk that the vendor is facing is also a big part of the equation. So one part is of course the service, and say you're paying 100 euros for the MIPS operations, but actually if you have huge punitive provisions tied to the contract, if you need the flexibility because you're in an offload scenario to reduce your, just sticking with an IBM example here, so the ARC and ROOK thresholds are maybe 50%, or you're able to reduce capacity from a index 100 to index 25, well, that increases the revenue at risk. And IBM being a big American corporation, they have spreadsheets that dictate the pricing you'll be facing if you have those kind of clauses in the MSA. So be sure to discuss whether that holds value for you or not. These terms extend to the entire portfolio. They are simple. They're based on a probability model. So that means that it's actually just percentages added to your overall cost. So we feel that is a very important part to discuss, and we're able to sort of isolate that for you and then make it slightly more a nuanced decision, so we can discuss whether that has actual value or not. Stephen talked at length about this, but sort of the consumption patterns. The reason we spend a lot of time on that is because the metrics for the pricing actually is very different across the vendors. And within IBM, all of these models exist. Some banks have their own definition of how they're measuring MIPS, and especially separation of specialty engines is incredibly important. I'll just get back to an example with SIP, which I think will be relevant for at least quite a few of you here today. So when we're talking about the metrics, that is very important. That's also where the rating comes in. Generally, and this is not to bash Gartner, but we generally don't see that being the optimal model, because for most clients that ends up being a bad deal. You can compensate and do all sorts of things. If you have a special version of the IBM metrics, where you interpret the LSPR tables into something else, be sure to make that very explicit in the contract. 20 was a year of quite a lot of these conflicts, and it's bad storytelling when we end up in a situation where vendors are overcharging for the amount of MIPS in the contract. And as Steven said, sometimes they have made some wrong assumptions about how this should be charged in their cost models, and that means that they are basically just working from mistakes made by the sales team. So some of this can be structural issues that we need to work with. When we have done this, we're able to sort of isolate, okay, if it's this just sort of a breakdown of what is the price or cost related to each of these. And typically you'll see that IBM and third-party software is a huge part of the cost. And once we have that, well, then this will be very different. This will be very different depending on what kind of installation you have. So being able to break this down and have a discussion with IBM or DXC or HCL about how we're charging for what part is related to the hardware MIPS, what part is related to the share of memory in a shared environment, how are we paying for SIP MIPS or SIP engines. I'll just get back to that example. Are we running batch or not? Is it production, non-production environment? All of that makes for a much more constructive and nuanced discussion. We're able to isolate IPs. We don't just have that as a notion, well, that's very expensive, so that's why you're getting a much higher price. And that is sort of the transparency that we strive for, because it makes for much less friction in these sort of discussions. It also means that we are able to get the upper hand, because the sales team typically have a hard time building or coming back with tangible changes to the assumptions made in the cost book. So that is actually, I'm not saying the whole point, but maybe 50% of the work that we do when we benchmark this and try to carve out and help support the negotiations, is actually to support the vendor sales team with changing assumptions. And some of this comes down to some pretty simple stuff, but where you typically don't have the transparency. And that is that most price books for IBM and DXC, of course there are some very brilliant people and architects that are part of this from time to time, but typically what we see is the MSU assumptions, when they get consumption data from you, are simplified enormously. So they'll assume a model, and then they'll assume a MIPS rating, and basically then they'll extend that high level of MSUs to all products. And that automatically inflates the IBM costs. So that's one of the reasons why we typically find 10, 20, 30, even more % reductions if you've never tried or never been through some of this transparency exercise. And in addition to all the hard work that we heard that D&D put into getting the quantities under control and optimizing the peaks, this is the best way to optimize deal economics on your outsourced operations here. I mean, there's a number of mechanical things in this where you need to look at the hard data. Some of you will have had the support to carve out and maybe struggle a bit to get the SMF records or big enough samples and so on. But once we have this data, it tends to be very hard to argue against the basic approach we have here. Yeah, it's just to say that you need to, once you sort of decompose this and look at all the different products here, so basically the models that we work with have, well, as some of you will know, some of the bigger banks will maybe even have 1,000 products installed in the mainframe. Some other smaller, for instance, smaller insurance company here has 75 products, and that's sort of the variance that we're dealing with. And there is huge differences in also the financial responsibility for across these different vendors, where the third-party licenses for SaaS Institute software or CA or ASG or BMC or whatever is partially is with the client and some is with the vendor, and that's why this is very important to sort of do this bottom-up exercise to be able to separate and have a discussion around what's fair pricing on this. Then just for all of you with SIP engines, typically one of the models that most vendors is pursuing is trying to discount SIP MIPS and blend it into either the MIPS price or have sort of a percentage, say 25% or 30% or 10% of the CP MIPS price as sort of the pricing metric for this. When you get to a certain size, and this follows sort of the increments of performance, you need to take into account what kind of machine you're running on, business class, enterprise class, and different series and so on. But basically, you'll end up, if your SIP consumption takes up half or close to a full dedicated processor, it will be way cheaper to buy it based on engines, and that's because the SIP MIPS, well, the whole point of those are they don't have any software costs related to them. and also the cost structure that all the vendors have with IBM. Not looking at BS2000 to 270, but if we look at IBM mainframes, then they are buying engines at a fixed price, and these costs, depending on what kind it is, but there's sort of a flat fee of 50,000 USD to buy one of those. So you end up in a situation where it doesn't make sense for you if you have a huge software stack of 800 products and then accepting a price of percentage of CPU's prices as the basis of your SIP capacity purchases. So this is a way to dramatically change this. I mean, I just wanted to touch on offload scenarios, and this is just an example where we're looking at what the changes in volatility or consumption over the course of a period here. For this, it's a big payment provider, and all of a sudden we expect that the volatility will change. That means that we then can look at different metrics. Many of you will, from the software side, of course, be familiar with 4-hour rolling averages. But actually, some of the clients, quite a lot of the vendors have percentiles which may be more favorable. Especially if you have batch loads. DXC is a pretty good example, because they basically don't charge for nighttime MIPS. And people with high batch volumes where the online part is coming down, well, that might be very attractive trying to look at that. This is an example of a client where the change in metrics had a huge impact on the amount of MIPS that they were charged. So this is sort of like small to mid-sized mainframe installation. But basically, all of a sudden, because there was a lack of clarity around the interpretation of the MIPS, what should have been, say, somewhere between 1,000 and maybe, well, in this case, 1,000 and 1,200 MIPS, that the increase in capacity and uncapped processes and so on led to them charging for much more, even 3 times more than what was actually reasonable given what was the market definition of the contract. This ended up being there was a number of issues identified here. They were also using large shares of SIP without coordinating this with the client, without passing on any discounts to SIP. So we have some of these cases where you need to take into account, okay, what is actually in the contract. And this is where typically we also talk to SMT data to make sure that we have a solid foundation and also collect the data over a certain period of time to be able to track these changes. So in addition to this time there was also some big price changes and so on. So this is an example where we were able to carve quite a lot of money. Many of you will be looking at transitioning to newer mainframes, so to Z14, Z15. Either you're planning right now or you'll be facing that in a year or two. And what is almost always overlooked is the technology dividends. There are these basically discounts on the IBM licenses built into co-financing the Z15 and Z14 and before that Z30 and so on. And these, given that NLC charges and AWLC charges are quite a big part of what you're paying, some of these, even up to 20% if you are in some of the higher brackets of use, which will be if you're running in, for example, a shared environment with, say, another bank or a big public institution or whatever, well, then you will be part of these benefits. That is that can be one of the points of using an outsourcer for this. But it's very important because typically vendors are looking to charge you for the hardware upgrade. So be aware that some of these these benefits can be capitalized during this transition. So what are the choices that you're looking at upgrading? Well, we believe that there are a couple of important scenarios to discuss. And this is just an example from one of our recent cases where the discussion was about, okay, we're actually looking at an offloading scenario. So should we try to stay with the step 13? Because of course there will be technical benefits of moving to step 15, slightly lower MSU usage and some other sort of technical benefits. But basically, one of the issues we'll have is, of course, that the offload needs to be concluded before it sort of end up service life for the step 13. So what does that mean for the discussions? And then another point we feel are important, sort of the timing of this. So have you been paying for an upgrade as part of your current contract? What part of the step 15 upgrade was included in the hardware refresh? Also important to just discuss, okay, the depreciation periods and the assumptions around the old contract. That's very important because mainframe relationships or contracts tend to be sort of long-lasting. So make sure you take that into account. Yeah, we're sort of running out of time here, but we included a few examples of also the differences in running a shared versus a dedicated environment, and some of this is important. And also what a sticky cost if you're offloading. We could spend a lot of time talking about that today, but we have just a couple of core examples for you to evaluate, okay, what are some of the price impacts of making some of these changes. So basically, a final note here is that be aware that there is quite a lot of key questions to clarify. Make sure you are having a objective discussion around this, and make sure that you have a well-prepared negotiation strategy where you know what the objectives are, what the success criteria are, and so on. Understand who you're dealing with, what ACL or IBM or TCS or whoever it is, what their interests are, and sort of make sure that you do your homework before you enter into these sort of negotiations. So then you'll be all set, and then you've at least taken care of a big part of this, which is the price discussions. We've included a little bit for inspiration some of the very important from IBM bonus schemes. What are some important services to leverage right now, so you can use those if you are facing software group or GPS or GTS in your upcoming negotiations. But that's in there for you to review in your own terms. Yeah, but thanks so much for your time, and hopefully this provided a bit of an overview on how we approach this, and it has been very effective for the past 12 years. So we are very keen to share this approach so you can get the best possible use for yourselves.